My friend, stop! We could tear it down, but we'd be tearing down a part of ourselves.
We're the sauce on your steak. We're the cheese in your cake. We put the spring in Springfield.
We're the lace on the nightgown.
The point after touchdown. Yes, we put the spring in Springfield.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we saw it for the first time, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke comes from. Regardless, each week, we pick one that at least one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, come together, and discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the man who puts the spring in Springfield, the Sheriff Ed Earl to my Deputy Fred Willikins, my co-host, Nate Storing. How you doing today, buddy?
I feel slicker than cat shit on a linoleum floor.
Okay. Wow. Good. That's
Feeling inspired by our good friend Burt Reynolds.
Yeah, man. Good old Burt. We're going to get into it. Well, if it wasn't clear from the opening, we will be talking about the episode Bart After Dark from season 8 of The Simpsons. Arguably, I think we've discussed this. This is might be my favorite season, or certainly my favorite showrunner era. And this is the one where Bart goes and works at a house of burlesque, I believe is what Marge refers to it as.
Yes.
Or as Belle refers to it as the... What does she say to Bart? It's the...
it's French for the back house.
The back house, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we're also talking about the movie that this episode's based on.
Of course. Very loosely.
The plot is based on.
Loosely based
Inspired by, let's say, which is The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. A movie that, I'd never heard of. I feel like it barely existed in my consciousness, and I was very surprised to find out that this was a big movie. Huge movie.
It's a movie that obviously, spoiler alert, I guess, neither of us had seen. I was vaguely familiar with it. I guess I was familiar that it existed because it was one of those musicals that I knew existed, and I was just like, what the hell is this? Along with, and this exists, there is a Debbie Does Dallas musical. Like a stage show based on the movie Debbie Does Dallas. I don't believe that there's any nudity or on stage sexual intercourse, but anyway, yeah, it was one of those things of when I in university kind of started digging more and more into the deep cuts of theater. I discovered that there's this thing called The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, and I was just like, what in the hell? Okay,
yeah,
sure.
What is it?
Yeah, exactly. It sounds almost like a Mel Brooks kind of situation. Right. And I was surprised to find out that it's not, and it's actually pretty good. But we'll get
interesting. We'll get into it.
We'll get into it. So let's talk about the Bart After Dark, and specifically the big show-stopping number, which may be... I would have to say top 5 Simpsons musical moments.
Oh, yeah.
The classic, We Put the Spring in Springfield.
Yes, we put the spring in Springfield.
We're that little extra spice that makes existence extra nice. A giddy little thrill at a reasonable price.
Our only major quarrels with your total lack of morals.
Our skimpy costumes ain't so bad.
They seem to entertain your dad.
It's interesting because, even though this episode is based on the musical movie, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, this song is clearly not inspired by that musical. It's a completely different kind of song, right?
Yeah, wholly original. Not one of their, parody songs like you get in the Sherry Bobbins episode or even the, My Fair Lady episode. It's just, an original Simpsons song, but it's sort of... I guess you could say it's driving the plot a little bit, but it's also just kind of here's an opportunity to be fun and silly and do a fun show-stopping number.
It's totally driving the plot because it's a persuasion song, right? Homer gets up and says, no, we can't tear this down because this is very much like Best Little Whorehouse in Texas because it would be tearing down a part of ourselves. Very interesting. But the song itself is kind of there's a musicologist, a Canadian musicologist actually named Darrell Bowman, I believe is his name, who wrote a huge long article about a lot of the different musical numbers in The Simpsons, and he talks about this one. He says that it's sort of inspired by 1920s Dixieland jazz. And potentially also, I think this makes a lot of sense, the sort of revival of that in the 1970s by none other than one of our favorites, Bob Fosse, right?
Right.
You get like Chicago is sort of a revival of that 1920s vibe. And he says that this actually even, it kind of is a bit like a sped up version of All That Jazz from Chicago.
Okay.
Come on, babe, why don't we paint the town and all that jazz?
In terms of the type of song that it is and musically and all of that. And I was like, oh, interesting. I wouldn't have put that together, even though like I love Chicago, I love Bob Fosse, but I wouldn't have quite put that together. And then I was listening to the commentary actually for this episode, and when they get to the parts where they're really in the burlesque house, David Silverman says, like, I always wanted to draw like Bob Fosse girls, like chicks.
Oh, no way.
That's what he says. And I was like, that is so interesting, because it's not something that really gets referenced that much on the show, but like it's interesting to see them kind of dive more into the sort of Bob Fosse aesthetic, right? Of like women in bowler hats and fishnets and all of that.
I was gonna say, like, obviously for people who have seen the film All That Jazz, which this is confusing because we keep saying All That Jazz. There's a movie All That Jazz and a song All That Jazz.
Right.
But in the movie All That Jazz, there's a few flashbacks to the Joe Gideon character, who is basically like an analog for Fosse himself, and his early days of working at burlesque shows, and very much is similar to what we're seeing in the Maison Derriere. But then I thought it was also interesting because one of the films that we like sort of teased maybe talking about for this season, but the reference is very, very slim, and I think we kind of just got scared and we're like, we can't do it. But Cabaret, I think they're also doing a reference to Cabaret in this because there's a shot, it's like a low angle shot of the burlesque dancers when Bart first arrives, and they're wearing the fishnets and the bowler hats, and it reminds me there's a very, very similar shot in Cabaret. I can't remember the name of the number, but it's late in the film, and it's when the MC ends up showing up as one of the Cabaret girls, and then they start like goose stepping, and it's like a Nazi thing. I think that that's referencing Cabaret. And then obviously the other reference is when, I think it's the episode with Jay Sherman.
It is.
The film festival,
it's the film festival episode, yeah.
Yeah, and then Mo sings his own version of like, as he's dressed as the MC for Cabaret.
Money gets you one more round. Drink it down, you stupid clown. Money gets you one more round. Then you're out on your ass. Whoa! Ah, my back!
So, Cabaret, great movie. We're not going to talk about it tonight, though.
Yeah, exactly. We could talk about that all day, but that's not what we're here to talk about. It's an interesting sort of mashup of things, because I feel like, really what they're borrowing from Best Little Whorehouse is the plot, right? And I think the plot works really well with The Simpsons, going to like, why did they parody this? It's like, well, this movie is so much about like mob mentality and how easily people are sort of swayed by, these days I think we call it like misinformation or whatever,
right,
by the media and by politicians, and like this town that's accepted a brothel there for like 100 years, within a couple weeks of, televised newscasts, turns against it. And so does everyone else. And so like, that's kind of the plot of Best Little Whorehouse, and that's sort of what's happening here too. But of course, in the end, they more or less save the Maison Derriere on The Simpsons.
We were saying before we started recording that like this might be one of our favorite episodes. I had forgotten, like, pound for pound, how many great jokes are in this.
Great jokes. And also all the dynamics at play are so classic Simpsons. Every person in the family kind of gets their thing. It's a little bit less maybe for Lisa, but like, Bart, Homer, Lisa, and Marge all kind of get their moments in this episode to really play their characters. You also get like lots of other characters in Springfield showing up. It's a who's who of all of the sleazy people in Springfield showing up. Except for Krusty. Krusty's conspicuously missing.
Yes, that's true, actually, yeah.
Yeah, it's weird that he's not at the Maison Derriere, but everyone else, like all of the other people, including Mayor Quimby, are there. And
Chief Wiggum twice.
Clancy! Hey, come on, you did me twice.
Right. And at the end, you get this, again, classic like mob mentality scene, which is such a huge part of the whole sort of Simpsons thing. And then also the musical number, which as the series goes on, becomes more and more part of the DNA too, as we sort of talked about.
Well, it's interesting because I was curious after I watched it. I was like, well, who wrote this? It's not a John Swartzwelder, obviously. It is season 8, so it's during the Oakley and Weinstein years. But it's written by Richard Appel, and these are some of the other episodes he's written, which, like, if you want to talk about heavy hitters, he wrote Mother Simpson, which is arguably one of the like sweetest episodes of the show. Bart on the Road, which is just a great classic Bart episode. The Secret War of Lisa Simpson. And the two Mrs. Nahasapima Petalons. And When You Dish Upon a Star. Some really like classic episodes written by this writer that honestly, like, if you were to say his name to me, I wouldn't immediately be like, oh yeah, he's a Simpson. Like, he's not he's not a Wally Wolodarski or a Jake Hogan or a John Vitti or like Oakley and Weinstein. Like these names where I'm like, oh yeah, he's a Simpsons writer. I would be like, oh, who is that? So, but here he is having written like not only some of our favorites, but like some of the legitimately best episodes in the show. I think
that's a good find. Huh.
I also love that the show opens with what might be like the most 1990s joke. I don't know if you caught it, where they're watching Itchy and Scratchy and the TV turns off and the kids are like, Dad, V-chip. And he's like, oh, sorry.
Yeah, what is that? I had no idea watching that what the hell that is.
Yeah. So the V-chip was a device. You basically plugged it into your cable box, and it sort of was like an intermediary between your TV and your cable. And it was the thing that basically blocked certain programming. Remember when we were kids, shows would always have the little like TV 7 or like TV PG, like basically like the equivalent of like the movie ratings. So as a parent, you could basically set, this is my understanding anyway, we never had one. A friend of mine had one, I'm pretty sure. But like you could basically set up the parameters for like what was and wasn't allowed. So the idea being that because they were watching a violent cartoon, the V-chip was intervening and wasn't allowing them to watch. But then like Homer is just like, oh, what? So it's like a super dated, weird joke that like doesn't play anymore. And I never noticed it until tonight. But I
couldn't even tell what the hell they were saying. I was like, what are they telling him to do? And just kind of let it ride. But now I know. That's fascinating. That must have only existed for a few years. I mean, it's like...
I feel like it was definitely a big thing in the 90s, or like similar devices to sort of like... One of my best friends in grade school, they had like a box hooked up to their TV so they could only watch like a certain amount of television. Like you had 30 minutes and after you were locked out.
Wow.
And... you know, if his friends came over for like a sleepover or whatever, his parents would have to enter in like the override code so that we could stay up playing like Ocarina of Time for 4 hours at night. And that was also how we ended up watching like Baby Blue movies on City TV, which like, again, if you know, you know. So this was a thing in the 90s of like ways to restrict television, which like now just seems so quaint in an era where like everybody has
streaming everything on every device all the time.
My 20-month-old knows how to use YouTube, so like it's just
right.
Yeah, but there's some other really great jokes in like even in that first act. I love when Lisa's like, think of all the animals we could like take care of, and Marge is like, you could take care of the animals here, like you could trim the cat's nails, and the cat just like crawls across the screen. And then I also love when Lisa says, well, this could be my birthday and Christmas present. And Marge goes, well, you already used that up on that peach tree, which you never play with. And then she goes, what are you talking about? I love my peach tree.
It's like a fully grown peach tree.
And then she runs out, and then Lisa starts singing, and she's like, oh, how I love my peach tree.
Yes, I do. Sure I do. Look. Here I am, flying on my peach tree.
Oh, all right, we'll go.
It's so stupid and silly, and I love it. And it's such like a kid's thing of like...
Yeah, it's not really a punchline joke. It's just like a funny, childish sort of thing, which feels very true to life.
And it's all in like Yeardley Smith's performance, which as we've very much been establishing this season, like she is the star of the show here. A couple other favorite moments are when Marge is having the town hall meeting to discuss the Maison Derriere, and she's going on and on about the house. And they're like, well, is it dilapidated? Is there something wrong? She's like, the house is perfectly fine. And then they're like, okay, well, then stop bad-mouthing the house. Like, it's just...
leave the house alone.
I love that. And then my other probably favorite joke is when Marge is showing all the people who have gone to the Maison Derriere, and so it's like Clancy, and then it gets to Barney, and like nobody says anything, and Mo
Oh, Barney.
I love that. I love Mo. Mo's one of my favorite characters. And then finally, my other favorite moment in the show is when after they sing the song and Marge misses it and they're like, well, could you sing it again? And it was like, well, it was kind of a you had to be here moment. And she's like, well, I've got a song. And she starts singing like the worst possible song before bulldozing down the house.
Yeah, now we love the house.
Well, I also have a song to sing. Morals and ethics and carnal forbearance. Sorry.
I do love it when you drop by, Marge.
I can't believe I almost forgot this. Probably one of my all-time favorite visual gags / moments in the show, which again doesn't play on a podcast, but it's when Grandpa shows up at the Maison Derriere. That GIF is literally like in Giphy or like the GIF keyboard on my phone. It saves like the ones you use the most. I use that all the time. I don't like. I love that gag.
Him walking in, seeing Bart, and then like just casually looping back out.
And then reopening the door.
Moment.
Is your name
Is
Bart?
your name Bart?
Yes. Does your father know you're here? It was his idea. Well, in that case, I have a whiskey.
Yeah,
I love it.
I love this episode. I think the thing that I appreciated it most, like rewatching it this time, was just that how quaint the moral outrage is. Right, and it's partly, of course, because it's like it's not a TV show where you can have like an actual,
bordello, I believe is the
bordello.
I think that's the appropriate word.
A brothel. A brothel.
Yes, there you go.
You can't actually have a brothel on The Simpsons. But it's funny that they like went so far in the other direction. It's not like it's a brothel, but they can't really say it. It's like, no, it's a burlesque house from the 1920s.
Yeah,
exactly. With like vaudeville comedians and like ventriloquists. And there's not really that much nudity. There's like maybe a little bit of nudity.
What's Bart's joke about like I tried ironing my birthday suit or whatever the hell it is? Like
Couldn't get the wrinkles out of my birthday suit.
There's some real good 1920s like style jokes.
Which is classic Simpsons too, of just like injecting this stuff from kind of like the first half of the century, right? Of like, the 1910s through the 1940s. There's always so much of that stuff in The Simpsons that like I am now only really starting to appreciate. And this episode has a lot of it where it's just like, it's totally anachronistic. I mean, at that point in time in particular, there were no burlesque houses. Like that wasn't a thing that anyone worried about from a moral outrage standpoint.
Well, what's funny too is how like, because I remember when we were in university together, burlesque kind of had like a renaissance. Like there were a lot of like burlesque shows going on, and then the movie Burlesque came out a couple years into us being at university together, which like, again, if you're looking for something to watch, pour yourself a big old glass of wine and tuck into Burlesque if you want an enjoyable night with a friend. But you're right, watching it now feels almost less dated because it kind of came full circle, but like at the time probably was like extremely bizarre and dated. So
and it kind of does go back to them wanting to sort of parody that like Dixieland 1920s jazz thing and Bob Fosse and all of that, and that just create that world, right, that they can kind of play around in. Totally. The other thing that struck me when I was doing some research about the movie as well for this, that I may or may not be a sort of influence on the song. At the 1979 Tony Awards, this show like swept, right? The best Little Whorehouse in Texas. And so they had a number that was like played at the Tonys called the Aggie Song. And it's probably the raunchiest number in the show, and in terms of like the lyrics and stuff like that. And so they get up on stage and they're performing it, but throughout the entire song, they're censoring a lot of the words. And the way that they're doing it is with a xylophone cue.
Yeah! We're gonna play a mouse and a mouse tonight. We're all and a bacon tonight.
So I was thinking about that, like when they get to the point where they start swapping in spring with like
we won't take
the boing sounds and like all of that sort of stuff. Like I wonder if there's any influence there, or if it's just a total coincidence, in which case cool coincidence,
Well, and you also found the note that this episode ended up winning a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Music and Lyrics for Ken Keeler and Alf Clausen. which of course it did. Like, it absolutely should. This number rules. It's
and I think it was Alf Clausen's first Emmy for this.
Oh wow, really?
For song at least, maybe. So like that's pretty wild to think that it took till season 8 to get like best song, considering all the things that came before this.
Well, should we tuck into the movie now?
Yeah, let's do it. Well, so it's your turn to give us your one-line summary of how would you describe this movie? One sentence.
A small town in Texas turns against their beloved, I'm using air quotes here, whorehouse, after a local television reporter, we'll call him for lack of a better term, decides to expose them, all the while Burt Reynolds and Dolly Parton are sleeping together.
Sure, yeah. It does kind of seem like there's two separate things going on.
I don't know, like, it's kind of, the plot is very straightforward. So there's the chicken ranch, and it's run by Dolly Parton's character. Burt Reynolds is the sheriff of the town, and it turns out that they're secretly having a relationship.
Sneaking around, you might say.
They're sneaking around.
Sneaking around with you.
And basically there's this television reporter, sort of sensationalist, kind of like a Geraldo Rivera-esque. That's a super dated reference. I don't even know what the equivalent now. I mean, this sort of TV stuff isn't really a thing anymore because cable news is just a shit show. But this was like this. I guess it would be like a hard copy or like the Simpsons equivalent would be like Rock Bottom, like a sensationalized news expose show. And he decides that he's going to do an expose on the chicken ranch, and then the town turns against the chicken ranch because of the sensationalized news reporting, and ultimately ends up being shut down. And then the movie takes a very bizarre, very serious turn and turns into like this very sincere love story. And Dolly sings, "I will always love you," and then they drive off into the sunset. And
it's almost like that song was shoehorned into the movie for some reason. I don't know why that would be.
I don't know.
I did find an interesting summary for this movie.
Okay.
So Dolly Parton, who plays arguably the lead role, one of the lead roles, she wrote a lot of songs for this musical and also included other songs of hers in the movie version, at least. And so one of those songs, actually, that was cut from the theatrical release was a song called, I believe, The Chicken Ranch.
Okay.
And instead of using it in the movie, they actually used it in the trailer. And it basically tells the entire plot of the movie.
Down at the Chicken Ranch, where a lonely girl could have a chance, and a homely boy could find romance at the Chicken Ranch. The sheriff and Miss Mona for years had been red-hot lovers and real good friends, but trouble snowballed like an avalanche at the Chicken Ranch. When Melvin Thorpe, a reporter of sorts, a self-righteous crusading fanatic, got on TV like you wouldn't believe and pointed a finger right at it, exposing Miss Mona, accusing the sheriff, then it rose to a roar from a whimper. It got all out of hand, a fit hit the fan when Thorpe stirred up everyone's temper. The Chicken Ranch has been recouped into song and dance, and I know you wouldn't want to miss the chance to come to the Chicken Ranch. It's foot stomping, rug romping, sexy, good fun. Come on down and bring someone. There's good times and trouble and fiery romance at the best little Texas Chicken Ranch.
So long, partner.
Y'all come back now, you hear?
Man, watching that, this movie's delightful. Like I have to, like, not to,
it's
like,
fun.
I don't want to jump ahead, but like I'm going to, because like I was shocked at how much I enjoyed myself. Maybe it's just because I really genuinely had no idea what to expect.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that the film does quite wisely, again, we've been talking about this a lot, is that it establishes literally from the first minute what you're going to get. The narrator, as it were, Jim Neighbors of all people, like he literally like turns to the camera and like breaks the fourth wall immediately. And
there.
Yeah, and sort of sets up what we're going to see. So it establishes the tone very quickly. I wouldn't say it's an extremely memorable movie, but I really enjoyed it. And this was the other thing too. I have like a interesting opinion about it. at least how it relates to The Simpsons, I was surprised because I think this film is the closest I've seen something that isn't The Simpsons come to being Simpsons-esque, and we'll get into sort of like when we get to the stuff that feels like Simpsons jokes but aren't. Like I have a whole laundry list because it's just like the way the songs are interwoven, that sometimes they're driving the plot, sometimes they're just like for fun. The wacky characters, like the Melvin Thorpe character that is like this comically ridiculous villain. Like he feels like an Albert Brooks villain, almost like a Hank Scorpio type. I don't know. Yeah, it was just, I was really sort of struck by how much it felt like a Simpson episode. But obviously it's a full-scale musical featuring Dolly Parton of all people.
Right. No, that actually makes a lot of sense. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I think what I would say is that I think Colin Higgins has a very high energy, almost cartoonish way of directing. Have you seen 9 to 5?
Yeah, and
which is similar
in terms of
movie. Which is a great movie. Similarly, like just fast-paced, right?
Yeah.
And it's that kind of jokes per minute thing that The Simpsons also does, of just like everything's constantly moving, and there aren't a lot of wasted minutes in this movie, which I think is pretty interesting.
But you also get that sort of sincerity. I guess it's more like a James L. Brooks thing, but like you get the heart and the romance subplot that maybe by the end is a little too heavy-handed and a little too serious.
Yeah, the very end, I think, is where it falls apart. But there are some genuinely really nice moments that, like, I agree, it's got a bit of that James L. Brooks thing of like, oh, these are real people who, like, actually fight about real things, who, like, have a genuinely sweet dynamic that I really was surprised by, and I really appreciated. It was, like, very unexpected for what I thought this movie was going to be.
Yeah, same here. This is definitely one that just kind of took me by surprise because, again, I didn't know what to expect, but I, within the first couple minutes, knew, oh, actually, I think I'm really going to enjoy this.
Yeah. Well, should we back up and, like, let's talk about where the hell this movie comes from?
Yeah, because, again, as you sort of alluded to, like, we both weren't super familiar with it. And it's funny, when Nate and I were sort of doing the short list of, like, what movies are we going to talk about? I was like, oh, this is really interesting because we're doing a bunch that are like based on Broadway shows, and then we're doing a couple that were movies first and then became Broadway shows, and then we're also doing a couple that like just are straight up movie musicals that have no sort of antecedent. And I thought that this was like a Dolly Parton vehicle that didn't exist prior to the movie, and then it was when we were looking it up, I was like, oh, holy shit, no, this is actually not only a Broadway show, but like a Tony Award winning Broadway show.
Totally. But there's I think there's a good reason why it's been forgotten a little bit. So in terms of where musicals are at,
because it's what year did it open?
It opened in 1978 off Broadway.
Okay.
And then moved to Broadway, I think maybe later that year. So you have Hair, right? Starts to kind of open things up in like the late 1960s in terms of sex on stage, right?
Right.
Which I think is like a really important precursor to this because it could not possibly exist prior to that.
For those who aren't super familiar, Hair famously featured, it was about the hippie movement, it was about the Vietnam War, it was very political, it was like very avant-garde for the time, and famously ends the first act with everybody gets naked on stage. And this was like groundbreaking, never seen before, caused a great deal of controversy, but it was like the sexual revolution has come to Broadway. It was a big deal.
For sure. And then you have Rocky Horror as well. But that's coming from the West End. So it opens in 1973 in London and makes its way to Broadway in 1975. So not that long before you're getting Best Little Whorehouse in 1978. So there's this sort of building momentum of like you said, sexual liberation coming to Broadway, and what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you deal with this? And I think one of the important sort of pieces of context as well is that you're also getting a lot of backlash to this, right? Of like, especially in the United States, like conservatives really being not happy about the way that this is kind of playing out in media, right? Like sexual liberation and all that kind of stuff.
How unlike conservatives.
Right, exactly. I know, I was shocked to learn that.
Yeah.
But so that really sets the backdrop for this musical, because this musical is actually sort of all about that conflict in a lot of ways, both taking advantage of the new sort of liberalization of what you can do on Broadway, but then also kind of addressing the conservative sort of bent of people really policing morality and all of that kind of stuff.
And I think that's another one of those things that ties it back to like my thesis of like this is like a Simpson episode. Like the level of satire here, like it's really taking shots at like that idea of moral panics and mob mentality, which is, as we sort of have addressed, that's a recurring theme throughout the sort of golden age of The Simpsons, and obviously a very important plot point in Bart After Dark. So.
Right. And like I think they had long wanted to get Bart into the context of working at a brothel, I think, or at a burlesque house or something. I think that had been on the board for a while, but I could see how seeing this movie or seeing the musical would be like, oh, that totally fits within the world of The Simpsons. Right. Like as soon as you see it, I could understand how they'd think that could be a good vehicle for a plot. So yeah, this is part of why I think this musical has kind of like not had the staying power of some of the other musicals that we've talked about, is that most of the people involved are best known for this musical.
Ah, okay.
Right. So Peter Masterson and Tommy Tune were the directors.
Oh, Tommy Tune, no way.
Do you know Tommy Tune?
Yeah, so Tommy Tune is like famous, like he's a tap dancer, I believe, but did you watch season 4 of Arrested Development? Where they're putting...
Yes, but
well, yeah,
Tommy
okay, fair
Tune
enough.
That?
Yes. So remember how Tobias is trying to get a Fantastic Four musical made?
Oh my God.
And he goes...
I don't remember that.
Okay, well, yeah. So there was that subplot. Daddy needs to get his rocks off. I don't even remember the context for why. But yeah, Tobias is trying to get a Fantastic Four musical made. And they go to see Tommy Tune to possibly direct it. There are 2 other things that he is very, very well known for, or at least are perhaps better known. The musical 9, which is the musical adaptation of 8.5, the Federico Fellini movie.
Yeah,
that
which
was subsequently
seems misguided frankly.
Yeah, very misguided, and was then subsequently made into a movie by Rob Marshall, who did Chicago, and everyone's like, oh, this is going to be the next Chicago, and it very much wasn't. We saw that in theaters together. And then the other thing that he's perhaps very well known for is a musical called The Will Rogers Follies, which is based on the life of the comedian / politician Will Rogers, who was a vaudeville performer in the 1920s, famously died in a plane crash. The only reason I really know about this is it was one of the early shows that I saw. I was probably like 7 years old. It came to Kitchener, and my parents were supposed to go, and my mom got sick, and so my dad was like, well, I'll just take Adam. But in the opening number, it has all these showgirls, and they're dancing around, and then they turn around, and they're wearing assless chaps. And my dad was like, oh, dear God, I hope my 7-year-old doesn't point out that he's seeing a bunch of bare asses. And apparently, it like completely flew over my head, and I didn't notice. But anyway, so Tommy Tune like famously directed and choreographed that. But so I'm familiar with Tommy Tune.
Famously is maybe a stretch. I mean, like maybe in musical circles, but like I have never heard of that.
Yes. Fair enough. But also, his name's Tommy Tune. Like, it's a ridiculous
I know, it's
name.
like, so it's like, he was born for the stage.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have music and lyrics by Carol Hall, another person who, like, I don't really know much about.
Yeah.
So I think that's a lot of it, is that, like, a lot of the other ones we've covered, it's these big names who have done many musicals that they're well known for, that were sort of like a franchise unto themselves.
And have been revived over and over and over again for years.
Right. And really, like, this team, especially when you bring them all together, is kind of like a one-hit wonder. I mean, like, Tommy Tune has a few other sort of well-known credits, but the rest of them not so much on Broadway. But it did very, very well on Broadway. It ran for over 1,500 performances, you know, wins a bunch of Tonys. So won for Best Performance by a Feature Actor in a Musical, Best Performance by a Featured Actress in a Musical, nominated for Best Musical, Best Book, Best Performance by a Featured Actress in a Musical, Best Direction of a Musical, and Best Choreography. So really, you know, like that year, 1978, was like the thing. But I think one of the most interesting things about this is that it is based on a true story.
Oh.
Yes. Oh, did you not know this?
No, I didn't realize that.
Oh, man. So, yeah, it's based on a 1974 Playboy article by a journalist named Larry L. King. No relation to Larry King.
Right, not the Larry King.
Not the Larry King, Larry L. King.
I'm your moderator, Larry King. Now a word to our audience. Even though we're being broadcast on Fox, there's no need for obnoxious hooting and hollering.
And so he basically, like, told the story of the Chicken Ranch, a real place. It's an illegal brothel in Texas that operated from 1905 to 1973. So it was around for a really, really long time. You want to take a guess at where it gets its name?
Well, in the film, anyway, it's because money got so tight during the Depression that the patrons started paying with poultry.
That's right. True story.
Okay, wow.
Sounds like a Grandpa Simpson story. But
it absolutely does, yeah.
Back in the Depression.
In those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 B's for a quarter.
People used to pay with chickens, and so that was where they got the chicken ranch. It indeed served athletes, politicians, members of the clergy. It is a lot like Maison Derriere in terms of that. Skinner shows up, and then the mayor shows up, and all these sort of important people. Yeah, it's it was sort of a tradition. It was part of the fabric of this town, for better or worse. They even had a cozy sort of relationship with the police, where if someone came in and said something kind of suspicious, they would pass on the tip to the cops, and so that they could follow up on it, arrest them, whatever. So there was this whole system, this whole understanding. This is in LaGrange, Texas. It's actually the subject of. There's a song by ZZ Top.
Yeah. I remember
that's
it from
this
Guitar
town.
Hero. Okay, no
that's
way.
This town, LaGrange. That's it. It's about this story as well. So then in exchange, they were able to continue operating until this Houston-based news reporter, he supposedly got involved because he thought that there was a connection to organized crime.
Right.
And as far as I could tell, I don't think that was ever actually proven. There was no sort of RICO case against the proprietor or anything like that. But that's why he supposedly went after them. Definitely it was big business. It was $1 million a year going in and out of this place, so to speak. And so, so yeah, he goes after them, and yeah, it gets shut down basically. The sheriff, again, real person who actually went to bat for this brothel. He even circulated a petition to keep the chicken ranch open, collected several thousand signatures from the people of LaGrange, Texas, but the governor eventually ordered him to shut it down anyway.
Wow.
So that's
literally
the
plot of the movie. That is the plot of the movie.
Right. The only thing that is not true is that there was no romantic relationship between Miss Mona and Sheriff Ed Earl. That did not happen.
There was no sneaking around.
There was no sneaking around. That's sort of taking some liberties. But this guy, King, who wrote it, he apparently hated musicals, which is kind of fascinating. I found this quote from him where he says, "As a writer, it irritates me when the story comes to a screeching halt so a bunch of bank clerks in candy-striped suits and carrying matching umbrellas can break into a silly tap dance while singing about the sidewalks of New York." which
so he's a big on the town fan.
I was going to say, sounds a bit like some musicals we have covered on this.
Yeah, a little bit.
But apparently Masterson and Hall were able to kind of bring him around when they actually did a table reading, and he got to see how it all fit together. And he's like, oh, It's going to actually work. But even back then, Hall and Masterson also wanted there to be a love story between these two characters. And King was like, no, absolutely not, because it's true story, and that didn't happen.
Right.
So in the original stage show, that's not how it goes down. It's sort of implied. It's like subtext or
okay. So that's a change for the film, the relationship between Mona and Ed Earl.
Yes. So that's a movie change. In the stage show, I think they sort of suggest that they had a relationship in the past at some point.
Right.
But it's not actually happening in the musical.
Interesting, because I feel like that's what makes it all work in the end. Apart from the ending, which we'll sort of address, but that's really, really interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and this is part of the thing with this series that's tough, is that I've never seen this musical, and it's not easy to find recordings of the stage show. So I've only read about what the differences are. And I would be very curious to see how this actually plays out on stage and which version I'd prefer, because it's a very important through line for the movie. I'll tell you a little bit more about sort of how the musical handles certain things as we go along, but it's a slightly different story, and I would be curious whether I'd enjoy it more or less.
Knowing the era that this is taking place. The Broadway show comes out in 1978, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail next week. Mm-hmm. But the thing to keep in mind is 1978, we're still sort of pre-mega musical era.
Right.
Evita, which is like some say is like the start of the West End mega musical sort of moving in. That was also 1978. It opens in the West End in 1978. But Cats, which I think is what everybody sort of considers to be the defining moment of like, okay, the West End mega musical has begun. That happens in 1981. So we're just before that sort of turning point where we're going to get to the sort of era that our generation certainly knows and loves and associates with musicals. But we're long past that sort of golden age of like the On the Towns and the Sound of Musics and everything.
Right.
And like you sort of said, I think it is interesting that we're coming off of the back of like the sort of 70s, maybe avant-garde isn't the right term, but like you've had Hair.
Like 70s cinema though, too, right?
Yeah, you've had Hair, you've had Jesus Christ Superstar, you've had Rocky Horror, you've had these things that are sort of like playing with the form, trying different things. And so making a musical about a chicken ranch is maybe not like the craziest idea in the world, even though like looking back on it now, like I said, when I found out that this was actually based on a musical, I was like, this is utterly insane. Like I could see a movie being based on this, but like rich New Yorkers are going to like see this on Broadway. Like that just doesn't,
but when you think about what people are going to see in the movie theater, it's actually like not that big a leap, I think, in terms of like what were the big movies playing and what was the
and that's what I mean.
It's like people were attracted to Scandal, I think, is a big part of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you had a couple other notes in here too of like that Universal apparently bankrolled the Broadway show.
Yep, like a lot of these musicals, they got wind of it. They bankrolled the stage show in exchange for also getting the movie rights. And like I think a few of the ones that we've covered had a similar sort of arrangement. That's the sort of bridge between the stage show and then the movie.
And then the craziest fact, there's a sequel?
There is, in fact, a sequel, a stage sequel, not a movie sequel. Very short-lived, did not last very long on Broadway. It is called...
go figure.
It's called The Best Little Whorehouse Goes Public.
Okay.
It opened in 1994. Can you believe that? So that exists. That is something that exists in the world. Don't know much else about it because I think it basically doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, musical sequels are not a thing, really. Right. And when they are, they never do well. Are you familiar with the musical Annie?
Yeah,
like
sure.
about Little Orphan Annie? Yeah, so there's Annie 2. I believe it's called Annie 2 Miss Hannigan's Revenge. Which,
no,
yeah, that's
a Simpsons thing.
No, I am 90% sure. Hold on, I'm looking it up.
Hannigan's Revenge.
I'm pretty sure that is what it's called. The first attempt at a sequel, which means there's been more than one, was called Annie 2 Miss Hannigan's Revenge, and then there was a second attempt with a different plot and score called Annie Warbucks. So there's been two sequels.
Annie Warbucks. That's the one where she has the bald head.
Yeah, exactly. And then famously, my favorite musical, Phantom of the Opera, has a sequel called Love Never Dies,
right? Which is actually a Bond movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it might as well be. But yeah, so musical sequels always misguided, never work. So yeah, how did this film come to be? Because I mean, it sounds like the show was a pretty big success.
Big success. But the movie, this is interesting, again, in terms of like movie musicals. Where are we, right? This is the wilderness. This is when movie musicals are really on the outs. The last successful Broadway film adaptation was Grease in 1978. Right?
Okay. So the year that the Broadway show of Whorehouse comes out. Right.
Right, exactly. But this movie doesn't come out until 1982. There's a bit of a gap there. And then other movies that are sort of floating around at this point, the film adaptation of Annie comes out in 1982 as well. It's a flop. Does not do well.
That's so wild to me because like that's always cited now anyway as like one of the great movie musicals. I mean, it has the cast is insane. Like,
I think it's been reclaimed a little bit for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But not a box office hit.
I didn't realize it was a box office flop. Wow. Okay, interesting.
There's not a lot of faith in the movie musical, I think, is the bottom line, which probably speaks a bit to how they approached this musical as well. But this is not the story for Best Little Whorehouse.
Yeah, like, so how did Dolly Parton get involved? Because, I mean, like, she's the big name at this point. And again, like, for this movie to be kind of, like, forgotten, but featuring the cast that it does. Like, you've got Dolly Parton, Burt Reynolds, Dom DeLuise, Jim Neighbors. Because, again, certainly I wouldn't associate Burt Reynolds with a musical. But, like, how did that all happen?
Yeah, so my understanding is that initially how it was going to work was the folks from the musical were going to do the movie, including the directors. They were very close to actually directing this.
Oh, wow.
And then the studio took them off because they didn't think they were going to be a box office draw. Go figure. Because these folks don't even have the credentials of like a Lerner and Lowe situation, right?
Right.
Where it's like, that seemed plausible. This is like, no way, who are these people, basically? It was a studio decision, and they sort of said, okay, who's hot right now? Dolly Parton is coming off of 9 to 5.
If you haven't seen 9 to 5, Dolly gives a incredible performance in that movie. She is so incredibly charming, and like, I was familiar with Lily Tomlin, familiar with Jane Fonda, and I was familiar with Dolly Parton, the country singer, and Dolly Parton, the sort of like campy character, but didn't really expect her to be good, and she steals the film, I think.
100%. And I mean, I'll be honest, like growing up, I feel like I had a lot of misconceptions about who Dolly Parton was, and was like really unfair to her. She's a very, very talented person, both musically and I think as an actress as well. And, like her success in that movie really speaks to that, in that she got a Golden Globe actress nomination. She won the New Star Golden Globe. The song 9 to 5, of course, was a #1 hit, won the Oscar for Best Song. And she also won 2 Grammys for that too. So it's like, that was a huge hit, right? And so I think they're really banking on that in this movie.
That makes sense.
But they're also really banking on Burt Reynolds too, who at this point in time is considered one of the most bankable actors in Hollywood. Literally, he's like on the list for the last 4 years. He's #1. He's a sure thing, which is wild because I haven't seen him in that much. And the movies that he's best known for are Smokey and the Bandit, Smokey and the Bandit 2.
Yeah,
Cannonball Run, Cannonball Run 2.
Yeah,
right? And
I guess Deliverance,
right? But that's 10 years before this,
right? Yeah. To be honest, I think the only other movie I can think of that I had seen him in prior to this was Boogie Nights.
Which he's great in, and that's his revival, because he this is the thing that's kind of weird, is this is the end for Burt Reynolds, basically,
right?
Until Boogie Nights, he's kind of doing schlocky stuff that gets no attention.
Right. But he is one of those actors that is a household name where okay, I may have never seen any other Burt Reynolds movies, but I know who Burt Reynolds is and have known who he is since I was even grade school, probably.
Right. Which is interesting because I feel like he actually occupies a very similar place to Dolly Parton in that way. Of you just kind of know who these people are, partly because frankly they're both sex symbols, right?
Yeah, it's that's true.
When this movie comes out 10 years prior, Burt Reynolds has his famous, it's Cosmopolitan, right? His spread where he's naked and all of that. And Dolly Parton was on the cover of Playboy, right? She never actually did a nude shoot, but she was on the cover and they did an interview with her. They're both sort of fried in people's minds as these sex symbols, and that's what they're banking on in this movie. That's a big part of how you get this to be a saleable movie. And also Dolly Parton's country music chops, right? This is a country musical. And so you really need someone who's going to be able to bring that crowd to the theater. I think that's also part of what they're trying to do here. And then I believe Dolly Parton brings on Colin Higgins, who's the director, who also directed 9 to 5. I didn't know a lot about Colin Higgins.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that's who the director was until you mentioned it. But
this is not a movie I've seen, which is probably a huge oversight. But the thing that he's probably most remembered for now is Harold and Maude.
Oh.
Yes. Which I would never have thought that those two movies are by the same person.
No.
But
not at all.
That came out of his master's thesis at UCLA. Harold and Maude.
Okay. Yeah, I also have not seen Harold and Maude, but as I've said many times on this show, thanks to the AFI Top 100 whatever specials, am familiar with it. It has a very large cult following. I'm pretty sure, and a Cat Stevens soundtrack that it's very famous for. And knowing what I know about that movie and then this movie, you would not expect it to come from the same mind. As
right. 9 to 5 definitely feels very of a piece with this, but that's not my impression of Harold and Maude. So yeah, just another reason to go check out that movie. But yeah, other than that, this guy, he grew up in Australia, flunked out of Stanford because he was too obsessed with theater, basically, and ended up working as a page at ABC. Which I thought was kind of funny. And then he eventually came back to Stanford and did his master's in creative writing, which is where he wrote the beginnings of Harold and Maude.
Interesting.
And this I really love too. He got really excited about film because he went to Expo 67 in Montreal.
Oh, no way.
For those of you that don't know, Expo 67 was a really big deal for movies because it was kind of the precursor to a couple different things. Like IMAX is kind of born out of that. And then also like really serious split screen is also sort of born out of that, because there are these sort of multi-screen displays that were sort of immersive, right? And that was one of the things that if you went, you would like definitely remember and would have been pretty exciting, I think, about like what the future of film is. Thinking about that being the motivating thing for him and how that relates to this movie is interesting, I guess. But you see a lot of energy in this movie, I feel like. That's the big thing, and a lot of excitement about film. It's kind of infectious. Whether you love the movie or not, like, it's hard not to get carried away.
Yeah, it's a very competently made film, which sounds like I'm damning with faint praise, but also like it's a competently made like movie musical, and like I think this movie is extremely well choreographed, but also well shot. Like
it's a movie, it's a real proper movie, which we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it doesn't feel like a filmed stage play; it feels like a movie, which I think is hard to do. It's really hard to do well. You know, apparently he, in preparation for this movie, this is his first movie musical, right? And
which is wild, because it does not feel like it.
Yeah, he actually watched old George Cukor movies, so going back to our My Fair Lady episode. And then he also watched Dr. Pepper commercials, apparently.
I'm a pepper, he's a pepper, she's a pepper, we're a pepper, wouldn't you like to be a pepper too?
This is just from Wikipedia, but apparently he said they have a lot of wonderful movement.
Sure.
Just like, okay, but you know, like I can see how like this could fit into like a Dr. Pepper ad. Again, it's just so energetic and so invested in entertaining the audience.
Yes.
That I kind of get it. And then the other crazy thing is this is also his last film as a director, because he actually died during the AIDS crisis. So that's really sad, really, really sad. But hard to believe that, you know, he has these kind of like 3 movies that really stand out. And he had other movies as well. Silver Streak.
Oh, no way. Yeah. I'm familiar with Silver Streak. Not a movie you could make today, though.
Right. But yeah, it's pretty sad, because I feel like there's probably a lot more that he had to give. The production of this movie, apparently, it sounds like it was really tough. The original cast and directors were like basically ready to go, and then they pulled the rug out from under them. So already that was like a big setback, and I think, you know, cost a lot of money. There was a lot of rewriting, a lot of all this sort of stuff that was going on. Burt Reynolds, you know, asked for a lot of changes to the script because he wanted to sing.
Which, credit where credit is due. I thought we were going to get a Rex Harrison sort of situation. He's pretty good. Like, he's not, I mean, he's not amazing, but he's better
no
than
Clint Eastwood. No, I'm just kidding. He's actually better than Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, I was going to say, he's no Gerard Butler in The Phantom of the Opera, but
he's no Lee Marvin.
No, he's no Lee Marvin. No, he holds his own up against Dolly, who is like a legitimately talented musician. So
totally. And I think both of them, both Dolly and Burt Reynolds, were dealing with a lot of stress at this point in their careers. So Dolly, apparently, like I was watching an interview, and apparently she was dealing with kidnapping threats to her family.
Oh, okay.
And also a recent, what she described as sort of like a professional breakup, like someone that she worked with a lot in her business life that she had to kind of like part ways with. And so that was very, very stressful for her. Burt Reynolds was sort of like on again, off again with Sally Field at the time. And I think was really on the outs at this point. So he was really like brokenhearted over her. And apparently Dolly and Burt Reynolds both like fought a lot on the set. Parton sort of said that there were sensitive times when things were said, not meaning to, that brought tears to his or my eyes. She's the most like
she's the sweetest,
like most. She's very compassionate, like good at putting herself in other people's shoes. So like, whenever she talks about it, she's very diplomatic about what sort of went down. But sounds tough. One executive gave an interview in Ladies' Home Journal in 1982 about the production, and he said the difference between Dolly and Burt is that when Dolly goes home at night and takes off her wig, she knows she's still just Dolly Parton. But when Burt goes home and takes off his wig, he doesn't know who he is. Which I thought was phenomenal.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, but like I said, you know, that speaks to the fact, like, this is kind of the end for Burt Reynolds. He's coming off, like, the highest high in his career, and then this is kind of it. He's going to be in the wilderness for the next decade. Like I said, the changes from the musical to the movie, the biggest thing is the love story that doesn't exist. Dolly's the one who kind of revives the idea of there being a love story. King hated it. He also hated the casting, and apparently he hated it so much that he even like challenged Burt Reynolds to a fist fight in a Playboy article. And Reynolds, when asked about it, like was like, "Yeah, bring it on." And of course, nothing ever came of it.
Yeah,
but like controversial.
It's just so interesting to me because like, what was the other film? I can't remember which we were talking about, but when changes are made that arguably make the thing in the end work, the original authors tend to be like, no, you can't do that. It's like
My Fair Lady was sort of had that problem, but where they added a love story potentially where the original author was sort of like, no, this is definitely not a love story. You're missing the point. And they were like, this only really works as a musical if there's a love story.
And I think this is the same thing. Like, I can't imagine this film if you didn't have the love subplot, because the ending notwithstanding, like, it's kind of what makes it all sort of hold together. And there's comedy that comes out of it. Like, there's the scene where Burt Reynolds and Dolly Parton first sort of reveal that they're sneaking around.
Oh, yeah.
And she's teasing him about the small breakaway briefs that she wants him to wear instead of the boxer shorts. Like, there's so much, like, beautiful, like, chemistry there. And like, if you get rid of that,
they feel like a real couple in that scene. Like, it's sweet, it's funny. And the thing that I love about that scene, which I think is actually kind of transgressive for the time, she comes out in lingerie and then she's like, I bought you this. I would like you to wear it. And he does it. He goes and he changes.
It takes a lot of convincing.
It takes a little convincing, but he goes and he puts on the black tearaway briefs, and then they go to bed.
And he has a great line. What is it? Like, it looks like 2 bowling balls in a marble bag. And then,
right.
And then Dolly's like, well, you think very highly of yourself, which is just like, again, she gives as good as she gets. And like, I
love that scene. And I love that song. I think it's great.
Sneaking around with you, going around that tree, doing what lovers do whenever they're sneaking around.
Yeah, I think it's the best scene in the movie.
And it's definitely the best Dolly addition to the movie, I think. Because that's one of her additional songs.
I really can't imagine this just working if it was just this plot of like, you need something else to make it feel like a film.
Right.
I think that's what it is.
So let me tell you a little bit of what I know about the musical itself. So the other things that were cut, there are 2 other characters that were, I believe, shot and not included in the movie.
Interesting.
Angel and Shy, and both of them are women who work at the chicken ranch. And Shy, in particular, is like a newcomer. And so a lot of the plot is about her kind of like learning how to be part of the chicken ranch. And it's very like bittersweet, because there's like a song about like the first time she's like putting on makeup and kind of getting ready for like work. And one of the songs that's cut at the end as well is called The Bus to Amarillo, is what it's called. And it's sort of about just like how people end up in the situation where they're working at the chicken ranch, and kind of that, like, in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty good situation. Like if you are going to be a sex worker, but the circumstances that lead you there may not be so great. So it is kind of complicated. And that's the one thing that I feel like is kind of like stripped out of the movie that sucks, is just like, there should be a little bit more of like the sort of bittersweetness of like, understanding like a little bit more of like where these women are coming from. And then at the end, it's like when the chicken ranch is shut down, it's like that should also be kind of like a bittersweet thing, instead of it just like, well, everyone got what they want,
Your Jim Nabors is very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is sort of the thing that kind of goes unsaid throughout this whole film, is like what leads these women to this circumstance. There is the line that Dolly gives of like, there's no pimps here, or like if a pimp comes around, you send him my way and I'll take care of him. Like there's so they are kind of addressing that, but like it does feel like that's something that's maybe not unsurprising for the era, but certainly this has been a recurring theme throughout all of the films we've been watching, of like rewatching these with a modern lens. You sort of recognize the sort of omissions that feel like, ooh, well, like nowadays this doesn't really fit or wouldn't get away with it. But I could see why they maybe chose to, in an effort to streamline things, remove those characters.
Right.
But they don't find a way to take those plot elements or the themes and emotions that are coming from that and sort of re-inject it. You kind of get it with that Hard Candy Christmas song, but not to the real full extent.
Yeah, I actually find that song kind of like weak in the grand scheme of things, and I'd be curious to hear more about like some of those other songs. But anyway, in terms of performance, like this movie does really well.
Oh, it really?
Yes.
So,
this is what I'm saying, is that it's crazy that this movie doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
It is number one at the box office, makes $11 million on its opening weekend, dethrones E.T., which is on its sixth week.
Okay, so like that in and of itself is...
Yep. It's the top grossing film of 1982.
Wow.
Fourth highest grossing live action movie of the decade.
What the... Right? Okay.
And it's the biggest weekend for a musical film ever at the time. How crazy is that?
And yet it just doesn't exist.
This is like a movie that, like you said, I would never have even like picked this out as a parody on The Simpsons per se.
Yeah.
It has kind of like no cultural afterlife. It's very strange. And maybe it's just because the subject matter is kind of tough for the most part. And like not the easiest thing to parody without like really putting your foot in it or angering people. And The Simpsons kind of thread the needle, but like I could see why it's not like parodied in a lot of other things and not talked about as much, because like this is the other thing about the whole sort of marketing journey of this is like they faced a lot of censorship. Like, I already mentioned the Tonys, right?
Yeah.
But it's like the title of this movie was censored a lot because the word whorehouse was considered obscene on TV, radio, all that kind of stuff. So it had all of these different alternate titles that were like floating out there whenever people talked about it. So it would be the best little chicken ranch in Texas, the best little body house in Texas, the best little blank in Texas, the best little house in Texas.
Nailed it.
Yeah, my favorite one was this announcer in Detroit that just clicked his tongue instead of saying whorehouse. So the best little in Texas.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's like just wild. This movie does as well as it does when like people probably don't even necessarily know exactly what it's called.
Yeah.
Like
well, and what
really
was it
wild.
rated? Because
it's rated R.
Yeah, so that makes it even more insane because again, obviously I don't think it appeals to children, but like it's not a PG or PG-13 may not even exist at this point. Yeah. So it's like
Adam,
so it's an adult.
This is the highest grossing R-rated movie ever until Beverly Hills Cop.
What the hell?
Isn't this bananas? But
it doesn't exist. Nobody knows that it exists.
I know. It's crazy. It's crazy. So
and on top of all that, it's got Dolly Parton. Mm-hmm. It's the follow-up to 9 to 5.
Right.
Which was like also a massive success. It's wild.
Yeah. Ultimately, the original budget for this movie was supposed to be about $10 million, balloons to $26 million. The movie makes $70 million in its original run.
Holy crap.
Yeah, so it does pretty well. And then on top of that, it gets an Oscar nomination. The only Oscar nomination it gets is actually for Best Supporting Actor for Charles Durning. Do you remember who he plays, or do you know who the recognize name?
Is he like the senator or
he's the governor
or whatever? Okay, yeah.
He's the governor. So he has that number, the sidestep, which we'll talk about it.
Which is a great moment in the movie.
Such a great
and a
moment.
Very Simpsons-esque number.
Totally. Yeah, the way they depict the media and politicians in this movie, very Simpsons-esque as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I mean, should we dive into the actual movie itself?
Yeah, for sure.
Let's start by just like talking a little bit more about these characters and about the cast. We've kind of talked a little bit about Dolly, a little bit about Burt, but then we have the sort of supporting cast as well.
Yeah, let's talk about it. You've got Dom DeLuise playing Melvin P. Thorpe, who is the sort of like investigative reporter, I guess. But when Sheriff Ed Earl goes to confront him about saying like, don't run this story, like don't get involved, his whole thing is like, well, I have to get involved because, the public wants the truth and I need to tell them the truth. All the while, you see him getting dressed and he's putting on fake shoulders to make himself look broader. Right. And he's putting on a corset so he doesn't look as heavy. Mm-hmm. And then he stuffs a sock down his pants to make himself look more endowed. So the whole, it's the hypocrisy of this person who claims to be a voice of truth and reason is pulling one over on his audience just as much as the things that he's apparently exposing, which, again, feels very Simpsons-esque.
Totally. I feel like a decade ago, I wouldn't have necessarily picked up on this, but his accent is also all wrong. It's completely wrong. He has kind of a Louisiana accent or something like that. It's Southern, but not Texan.
No, and he reveals that he's actually from Jersey or something.
He moved to Texas 6 years ago, I think is what he says.
Right.
I think it's definitely implied that he's putting on this accent. It's not supposed to be an accurate Texan accent. So yeah, there's like lots of nice layers to all of the fakery going on with him. Seems to be wearing a wig, like all of that kind of stuff. Were you super familiar with Dom DeLuise before this? Because I'm not really that familiar with his work.
So I assumed that he had to be in this movie because they were trying to, again, play off of the Burt Reynolds relationship, because he's in the second Smokey and the Bandit movie, and then he's in both Cannonball Runs, I believe. So like he and Burt have worked together and kind of become like this comedic duo. So I was like, okay, that must be why he's in it. Weirdly, this is very bizarre, but the thing I know him from was, do you remember Lamb Chops? Like Lamb Chops Play Along? Like Sherry Lewis and Lamb Chop?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay, so there was the TV show. Hi everyone, it's Adam from the future. So at this point in the episode, I go on about 6-minute tangent trying to figure out what this Dom DeLuise, Sherry Lewis, Lamb Chops connection is. We're going to spare you having to listen to it right now. Needless to say, we're going to jump ahead to the point in the episode where we get back on track with the film. But if you want to hear this very, very long-winded, bizarre side tangent, it'll be at the end of the show. Okay, back to the show. All this to say is, weirdly, yes, I am familiar with Dom DeLuise.
Apparently, he's also in the Muppet movie, so you've probably seen
he is in the
that.
Muppet movie. Yeah, he is in the Muppet movie as one of the like many cameos.
Yeah, and Failsafe too, which we talked about.
Yes, weirdly. Oh, he's also in a movie called Silence of the Hams, which was like at the peak of like, remember there were like all those Zucker Brother parody movies. This is a parody of like Silence of the Lambs, kind of. But it was like made by like an Italian guy who didn't have a grasp of language. Anyway, I just remember the box art from like at Blockbuster. It is Dom DeLuise, and he's got like a butterfly on his nose, and he's like, because it's like a parody of the Silence of the Lambs cover. Anyway,
wow, we went down a deep Dom DeLuise rabbit hole.
Yeah, who knew?
All right, let's talk Charles Durning.
Let's talk Charles Durning.
Okay, so he's,
which is a name that it sounds familiar, but I don't know why.
Right. Okay. Well, so I have some research here. So, a couple things. First of all, this guy is actually trained as a ballroom dancer, and to the point where he actually taught at a Fred Astaire dance studio in New York. It's kind of interesting. Like a lot of these folks actually have a little bit of musical background. He was in a musical called Queen of the Stardust Ballroom, which I've never heard of.
Yeah, never
before,
heard of that.
But again, he has some chops. Charles Durning is also in the Muppet movie. He's the villain who owns a frog leg restaurant.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's what I know him from. Yes. And he's trying to capture Kermit the Frog because he wants to eat him.
Right, exactly. So there's that. He's also in a lot of other Burt Reynolds movies. So I feel like both Dolly and Burt are bringing a lot of their people into this movie, right? And so, yeah, Charles Durning's another one of those people. He collaborated with Burt Reynolds on 5 movies from the 70s to the 90s. So he had like a long-running relationship with him. And some other movies you almost certainly remember him from: The Sting, Dog Day Afternoon, Tootsie, Hudsucker Proxy, and Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Okay.
So he's in a lot.
I know all of these movies.
Stuff.
I just don't.
I don't remember what he is in any of these.
Yeah,
he's in all of these really good movies.
So I'm just looking it up on IMDb. He is Lieutenant W.M. Snyder in The Sting, which I don't remember that character. I mean,
I presumably.
Great, yeah. And then he's Moretti in Dog Day Afternoon. Again, don't really remember. So weird. He's in like some of the best movies ever made, and yet I don't necessarily remember him. But okay, good for him. But he had a good career.
He's great in this too. Like,
he's so good.
I mean, I like there are actually a lot of good numbers in this movie, but I think Sidestep, which he does, is my favorite.
Ooh, I love to dance a little sidestep. Now they see me, now they don't. I've come and gone. And ooh, I love to sweep around a wide step. Cut a little swath and leave the people alone.
The song is great. His performance is great. And it's one of the best blends of filmmaking and musical performance in the movie.
Yeah.
Where it's like
it's
they're
really
actually
it's really well edited to like
super clever. It takes place over multiple scenes. So you're actually like moving through time, different settings. And there's also some like trick editing in it as well, like where it's kind of hard to explain, but he's sort of dancing. It's in the Texas State House, the first movie to ever be shot in the Texas State House. He's dancing very well to this musical number. And the camera is sort of panning across the space to follow him, and then he'll sort of disappear behind like a pillar or a wall or something like that. The camera will move back, and he will reappear behind another pillar and wall on the other side of the room and continue dancing. And it's like, clearly there's a cut hidden somewhere. But like, it's very adeptly made and performed. I love that number, and I think he's fantastic in this. And again, like, true definition of a supporting role where he's only in it for, what, like 10 minutes? You know?
Yeah, he's barely in it, but like, it is a memorable performance for how little he is actually on screen.
It's sort of the climax. He's kind of the Wizard of Oz in this. Burt Reynolds' character finally decides, like, okay, he's got to stand up for the chicken ranch, so he goes to the Capitol and is going to meet with the governor, and when he does, it doesn't work out, basically. But that's when this number happens. And then you have Jim Nabors.
Gomer Pyle himself.
Gomer Pyle. Pyle? Shazam! Pyle, Shazam! But yeah, I mean, what do you say about a guy like Jim Nabors? He's, you know, what, like, best known for his role as Gomer Pyle. This is his first feature-length film.
Wow. I mean, he's fine. Like, he's kind of outclassed by everybody else in the movie, but like, he serves his purpose. He keeps doing the thing where he's trying to tell Ed Earl something, and he's just like, shut up, I don't care. Like, the relationship they have is good.
He's actually another Burt Reynolds guy. He was in Cannonball Run 2. He was in another movie right after this with him called Stroker Ace. No idea what that is. But, you know, he had like several movies where it sounds like Burt Reynolds was sort of like, I want you in this movie, like as a cameo or as a whatever. One interesting thing about him is that, like, Jim Nabors had like record contracts throughout the 1960s and 70s, and he does not sing a single note in this movie.
Nope.
Go figure.
He sure doesn't.
So that's kind of interesting. He sang Back Home Again in Indiana before the Indy 500, the race, from 1972 to 2014, every single year, with like a few exceptions for like illness and stuff like that.
Right.
But like,
good for him.
This is a guy who like clearly sings. You know, I don't know how good he is, but like, but it's just interesting that he doesn't have a singing role in this.
That's
funny.
mean,
overall, I'd kind of just like, this character kind of doesn't really need to exist.
He's functioning as a narrator, and you probably could have written around it if you needed to. It feels like he's just there sort of for like cheap laughs, and maybe to like capitalize on the association with Gomer Pyle to like, again, put bums in seats. I don't know. I feel like when you've got Dolly Parton and Burt Reynolds, you're probably not relying on that, but who knows, right? Like, maybe it's just to pull in a different demographic or something.
Yeah. But it's kind of a mystery to me, but, you know, he's there. We've talked a little bit about the sort of filmmaking, I guess, aspect of this. And as I said, it's just, I think it's one of the most cinematic movies we've covered in this series in terms of it, like, really properly feeling like it belongs in a movie and couldn't be done on stage.
Well, and you get the benefit of it coming out when it came out, because we've sort of discussed this, like, when do movies sort of become quote unquote modern? You know, you've sort of posited that Star Wars is the film that sort of changes everything. So this obviously comes out post Star Wars. It comes out post Grease. For all of the things I could say about Grease, I think it's one of those films where it feels like a film. It captures the choreography really well. It uses cinematic techniques really well. It feels big, and it's doing something that you could not do on stage. And this sort of feels like it's in that same vein. There are some, you know, crane shots, and there's interesting uses of montage. And it's interesting comparing, you sort of alluded to it before, the Aggie song in this compared to the version at the Tonys, and just how completely different they feel.
Right.
And how it works so much better here, I think.
Yeah.
Even if it is weirdly the most sexual number in the movie and the most bare ass I think I've ever seen in a film.
For sure. And that is the cut down version.
Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that is weirdly, in a movie about a brothel, that is probably the most sexual, most erotic scene in the movie. And it's taking place not in the brothel, but in, you know, the change room of a football team.
So we haven't really addressed this. There's this whole subplot here,
right,
which you told me is based in truth.
I believe so.
The Alumni Association for this Texas college.
No.
Whatever.
Not the Alumni Association, I don't think. But
No, they say the Alumni Association.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Go on.
So anyway, maybe I'm mistaken, but basically, like, whatever team wins this football game, the Alumni Association, I'm pretty sure, pays for them to go to the chicken ranch so that all of the men can be serviced.
Yeah.
Which is the most insane thing. And then, like, when they arrive, it's like a senator or whatever.
Senator's
who greets
there.
them.
He's the one who tells them this after the game, right? Like, he comes in and is like, yeah, we're gonna go do this. And he goes with them.
And he goes with them, and then he pretends not to know Miss Mona, and then she's like, I've known you for, like, you're not fooling anybody. And he's like, okay, I'm just joking around.
It's always a business doing pleasure with you.
Yes, that's a great line. So there's the song, the Aggie song, which is the song after they've won the game, and they're in the locker room, and they're basically talking about, hey, look at us, we're all gonna go have sex now.
We're gonna wham and bam and a thank you ma'am tonight. I swear I don't know how those hands such ecstasy.
And it's a bunch of, like, shirtless dudes line dancing.
Ripped.
Like, it is an incredibly homoerotic number for what is essentially supposed to be a bunch of heterosexual men about to go have sex with women.
Yeah,
but clearly it
is worth mentioning that Colin Higgins is gay, and
you don't say.
Yes, and apparently the extended cut, the bootleg extended cut of this scene became quite popular at a Chicago gay club, and was sort of like a cult hit. And you can actually find the extended version on Vimeo. And most of the extended part, I mean, number one, the dance sequence at the end, which is phenomenal.
It is genuinely phenomenal.
Has another, it's like twice as long, if you can believe that, which is kind of too much. But then the other chunk that gets extended is the shower sequence where they are completely fully naked and they sing an entire verse naked. And it's almost like the Austin Powers gag where he's naked and they're like moving teacups around and covers. It's kind of like that, right? Like where it's like,
that's actually
kind
of
funny.
funny.
Basically see everything, but like just barely not making out the details, right?
Right.
And again,
right.
it's like, you see some breasts in this movie, but like you actually don't see a lot of sex between men and women.
No,
and you don't.
And when you do, it's
including Mona and Sheriff Ed Earl, you don't really see them, get it on. So it's like,
when you
for
do
an R
see
rating,
the
it
sex,
feels pretty tame in some ways. But then you get this scene where there's actually like a lot of nudity.
Yeah, it's weird because in the opening number, when they basically sing the song about the brothel and they're sort of establishing everything, there is sex on screen, but it's like shadow puppetry, for lack of a better term. There's no like on-screen penetration or anything like that. But yeah, like you're right, for a movie about a brothel where theoretically sex is a very key component, there is very little sex in this movie, which is why it is a little bit because even like I don't remember there being much in terms of swearing. There's basically no violence. So, like, I feel like it's a movie
just
that's rated R
matter.
just because there's no other rating at that point. Like, PG-13 maybe doesn't exist, but because that PG-13 is created because of Raiders of the Lost Ark. So, and that was that also 1982?
Yeah, we're right in the
1981.
ballpark.
So maybe, if PG-13...
like I think it really is like, number one, it's the nudity. Because there is a lot of nudity, but it's just not always that sexual. And then the other thing is just the content. I think it's the subject matter that gets them. It's like the name is being censored, right? And so the very premise of the movie is considered obscene. And
it's adult content.
And honestly, like the lyrics of the Aggie song are more explicit than like almost anything you hear in film these days. It's pretty rough. So like, I feel like that stuff is maybe what really gets them. I'd be curious to see how they break it down. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of the filmmaking, just going back to that for a second, like one of the interesting things I noticed is that there were 5 credited editors on this movie.
Right. Yes.
Super weird.
That is wild.
Yeah. And so I was trying to like look at who these people are and like why would they, because there's no explanation I found as to like why there were so many people on it. But my guess is that the original cut was 2 hours and 30 minutes.
Oh, wow.
The director's cut.
That's long.
Right. And so like this
Because this
yeah.
As for as much as I like this movie, I surprise, I thought that it could have been shorter.
No, really?
Yeah, I know, right?
I thought
Shocking.
this one was perfect in terms of length. I think they wrap up the ending a little too neatly, but I thought in terms of length, I thought it moved along pretty nicely.
Like of all the movies we've watched so far, like it definitely moves the best. But again, I think that final act, because it's just not working, like I kind of just feel like you could tighten everything. But 2 hours and 30 minutes, I think we would have been bordering on like slog territory.
Oh, for sure. And this is why I think they removed Shy from the film, was that like that was one of the things you could like fully just lift out, right, and say like we're just not gonna have that character and cut around it. And so that's, I think, also part of why Jim Nabors provides the narration, is because that gives you some way to paper over any of the sort of like story hiccups that might arise from cutting it down.
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense.
Right. But like in terms of who these people are, it also kind of gives some interesting hints about like why would you have 5? Basically, you have 2 Dolly Parton / Colin Higgins guys, Nicholas Eliopoulos and Pembroke J. Herring, right?
That is the best name I've ever heard.
Which one?
Pembroke J. Herring?
Pembroke J. Herring. Yes, that's...
I'm stealing that
seems
for
quite
sure.
proper. You have a Colin Higgins guy that he's worked with before, named David Bretherton. And then you have one Burt Reynolds guy named Walter Hanneman that worked with him, I think, on Cannonball Run. And then a total or relative newbie, I guess, Jack Hofstra, who like hasn't worked with anyone else that I could see on the production. So like all of those folks are involved. But it's like, again, you have like someone from the director and you have people from both of the stars weighing in.
Right.
I think the other thing that I'll point out, coming back to Bretherton, is that he's the one who has like the most musical chops. Particularly, he won the Academy Award for Best Editing for Cabaret in 1972, which is possibly one of the best edited films ever made, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I would say beat out only by All That Jazz, probably.
Right.
Like, you know, the other Fosse masterpiece.
Right, but it's a movie where like literally the editing is the only way that movie works, because it's all
100%.
about intercutting and the way the numbers fit in with the story, and like it's so mind-boggling how they put that together. So like he works on this, and I would say, you know, it's like this is not Cabaret, but like there is some really nice like montage and intercutting and interesting stuff that goes on in this movie that is above and beyond like some of the other movies that we've watched in this series.
Well, and it does the thing that in recent years is sort of like the main complaint that people have with sort of modern musicals, and I think it really started with Chicago, ironically, even though that film was trying to pay tribute to Fosse's style.
Right.
But that movie is arguably overcut, because one of the things that Fosse was so good about was like just letting things play out in masters or with very little editing. You know, we talked about this with On the Town, you know, those numbers, sometimes like full musical numbers that go for 5 minutes have like all of 10 cuts in them or whatever.
Right.
So this film, I would say, is kind of similar in that it really, when it needs to, it lets shots play out. Like the Aggie song is a perfect example of like, when they're doing the line dancing, it's not like constantly cutting to close-ups and all this other stuff. No, let's just let this incredible choreography play out. Or when you've got the song The Governor sings, where it's doing like the trick stuff, and it's trying to sort of further the plot or further time and all this stuff. Like it knows how to play with editing to use it to its advantage, and I think that is,
and when to use it and when not to, because like
exactly,
you know, like a lot of it is like in between things there are montages to kind of connect the dots or explain things, or like there's one really great montage I think when Ed Earl is like, I'll take care of this whole controversy, and he calls up a bunch of people, and it's actually kind of a very Simpsons-y sort of moment as well, where it's like he calls up all these people and they're all kind of like yeah, no, I can't help you. Nope, can't help you. Nope, can't help you. And then it just cuts back to that scene, and like all of the work that went into like setting up all those shots just to get that one, you know, piece of dialogue. I love that sort of stuff. Or I think you also called out there's a great scene when the television news story is going out.
Oh yeah, it's so good.
Right. You're seeing the story, but then it's cutting away to all these different scenes of people watching it in these different contexts, right? And you get like an old folks home, and then someone's holding up like a liquor store.
Yeah, I would say it's the most Simpson-esque joke in the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
A guy is holding up it's either a liquor store or a convenience store, but both the thief and the owner or the cashier or whatever turn to watch the TV and are like, even they are sort of struck by what is being told. But like, it's just so Simpson-esque that like the guy is literally holding a gun to the guy's face and then they're both like distracted by the TV.
Right. Yeah, totally.
But yeah, it's a great example of like using this sort of montage to like, again, further the story and do something that you could not do on stage.
Right, 100%. So yeah, like we talked about like some of the numbers I think that stand out to us, but are there any others that you feel like we should call out before we kind of move on?
It's funny, the songs aren't necessarily memorable in the way like an Andrew Lloyd Webber song is memorable, in that like you leave the show humming all of the songs, mainly because it's like 4 songs that have just been like repeated over and over for 2.5 hours.
Right.
But the songs are genuinely great. They're catchy, they're fun, they're lyrically interesting. I'm not a big country western music kind of guy, but like I really enjoyed like even that element of it. It kind of, they're not like traditional musical theater numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like they kind of feel a little bit more contemporary and like pop music-y in a way, even though like it's obviously country western, but you know what I mean? Like it doesn't have that traditional like musical theater-y sort of thing that I think can be a little off-putting for people.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think like it helps that the ones that are sung by like Charles Durning and Dom DeLuise have a bit of like satire in them too. Like they sound like they could be a Simpsons song where it's like
they really do.
Where
they
they're really parodying
like
the sort of hypocrisy of TV personalities and politicians. I think they do a great job at that. There aren't that many numbers in this that I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Like most of them are very memorable.
Mm-hmm.
This love story, I guess, that runs throughout the whole movie, how does it work for you in terms of, like the chemistry between them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've sort of addressed this, but like, I think it's crucial to making the film work.
Mm-hmm.
I think both Dolly and Burt have very strong comedic chops, obviously, but it's the chemistry and the relationship between them and the jabs and the barbs and all of that that I think is what I found so charming and delightful. I think where it kind of falls apart is where it becomes a little overly sentimental at the end when she breaks out into I Will Always Love You. Yes, the Whitney Houston song, which is actually originally was written by Dolly Parton.
Right.
I texted Nate to be like, wait, holy shit, I Will Always Love You comes from this movie? And you corrected me to say, no, she had already written it and recorded it and then decided to re-record it for this movie. And then it...
Yeah, a total pro at this. She had a lot of re-releases, so she re-records it for this movie. So already a hit back then. She re-records it. I think it breaks the top 50 again. She wrote so many other songs for this that weren't used and found ways to reuse all of those in like subsequent albums, subsequent movies. She reuses a song that she wrote for this in Rhinestone.
Okay.
Which is, I think, her next movie, which I think was a bit of a flop. But, like,
yeah,
she was really efficient, I guess. She's a business lady. She's a smart
business lady. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. But yeah, anyway, that was a sort of sidebar. But yeah, you were saying at the end when she sort of breaks out in I Will Always Love You, it feels unearned, even though like they've spent all this time building up this relationship between them, but they don't have that kind of relationship, I think, is kind of the thing that feels out of place.
I think the thing that, for me, the movie kind of peters out in that final act because you look at the poster and it has that sort of Mel Brooks-esque sort of like Animal House style. So you expect a very zany, wacky movie. And for the most part, it delivers on that. It's maybe as zany and wacky as a musical comedy can be, where you're still going to have like big production numbers. You've got that sidestepping number. Like there are these scenes that are very silly and played for laughs and work really well. And then all of a sudden in the final act, you get Hard Candy Christmas, which is kind of this like schmaltzy, I understand what they're going for, but it's like that last sort of 15, 20 minutes of the movie, it takes a total turn and it just like, there's no more wackiness. It's just very serious. The house is closing down. all of these people are now without jobs and have to like figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. And then there's this romance subplot, and she's going to sing I Will Always Love You, which like, again, for our generation, and this is like the looking back thing, but like has become immortalized by the Whitney Houston version. So like you have this association of it being like this big epic love song sung to, you know, another person. So it's just like tonally the film shifts in that final act in a way that it really kind of doesn't work.
And I think that's the thing is like in the original musical, I think it pulls that same shift, but there's no love story. That part doesn't happen. It's more just focused on the serious sort of sadness of like the closing, all these people moving on, and like what does it mean for everyone? Like that's kind of more the focus. It's a little bit more like melancholy and bittersweet. I would be really curious to see how that plays out because it's hard to imagine in this movie because it is so different.
It's interesting because usually in shows like this, you're going to end with like this big show-stopping number where everything turns out okay, or like there's some last-minute twist, and then, you know, everybody sings and dances into the sunset or whatever. And this doesn't have that, really. Right. It just sort of has a reprise during the credits in a kind of silly way.
It's just a little bitty piece of country play.
That was the thing for me that works the least in the film. But for the most part, I think the love story between them is interesting. It's played really well. It's very, very believable. I love the power dynamics between the fact that even though he's the sheriff of the town, like she really is calling the shots, and like she kind of has him wrapped around her finger, and it's hard to imagine it not being Dolly and Burt because I don't know that it would necessarily work otherwise.
I think their performances are great. I think their chemistry is great. I love the sneaking around scene, and we've already talked a bunch about that.
Sneaking around with you.
But I also love like some of their other sort of like tender moments. They go up to the lake at one point, and they have this sort of like heart-to-heart conversation. Mm-hmm. Apparently some of that was actually improvised. It's crazy. The part where they're talking about Mary Magdalene, which is super thematically relevant, improvised. And then, they have a really great fight, too, you know, near the climax where he tells her to shut it down for like a month, and she doesn't. She like does the big she services the Aggie team.
we haven't
get into that.
Discussed the most ridiculous plot point,
right?
But yes,
right. So she does that, and he's mad that she lied about it, and then she's mad that he didn't protect her, and it's like they're both really good in that scene, I think. Like,
that is another great scene.
Authentic. So
remind me how as to the best of your knowledge, how the theatrical show ends, because in the film, basically, Ed Earl comes back to the chicken ranch and is like, I'm sorry, like we're shutting you down. There's nothing we can do. She sings I Will Always Love You. He basically leaves and then comes back and then says, no, I'm going to marry you. And then he like whisks her off her feet, and they get in the car and they drive off into the sunset. And then it's just like a reprise of one of the numbers. And then it ends with, y'all come back now, you hear? And like, that's it. Like everything's wrapped up in a neat little packet, as Homer would say.
Really? I mean, sorry if it sounded sarcastic.
Right. I mean, like, from what I can tell, I don't think that the stage musical has a happy ending, is the short answer.
Right.
Act 2, you have like Hard Candy Christmas, right? Which is in both. In the stage version, then you have a finale right after that.
Right.
I don't know exactly what the finale is. And then the last song of the show is this song I mentioned, The Bus from Amarillo, which is Miss Mona singing alone. And it's a very sort of like melancholy song, again, about like, you know, the life of a sex worker, basically, like looking back on her life and like the choices that she made. And it's not like moralistic about like, oh, I wish things were different and, you know, whatever. But it's just sort of like, you know, bittersweet. Things were tough to get here. And, you know, this was sort of a safe place, but now it's gone. And now we're all moving on again, right? And we don't know what's coming ahead of us. As much as this musical is very like fun and bubbly and satirical and everything, I do kind of wish that there was a little bit more of that edge at the end, because like it is a sad story. It kind of sucks that they slap on this sort of like, and everything worked out at the very end of like literally just a Jim Nabors narration being like, yep, and they all lived happily ever after. Like, you know, kind of like as though nothing happened that mattered in the story other than like Miss Mona and Sheriff Ed Earl getting together, you know? Like there's not any moment where she kind of like takes one last look at the house and closes the door, or, you know, like just anything to just kind of like mark that like this is the end of something. Instead, it's just kind of like this happy ending, which is feels.
We're gonna get married and everything's gonna work out, but it's like, well, is it though? Like, what about all these girls who left? And like, it just kind of feels like they glossed over the ramifications of shutting this place down.
No, not to mention, I'm not sure if you sort of like clocked the weird order of things, but like, so Miss Mona has a housekeeper named Jewel, real person, very interesting story there. Apparently she acted as kind of like a bouncer for the real chicken ranch. And unfortunately, one of the groups of people she left out was people of color who were not allowed at the chicken ranch, but she was a black person who was doing, anyway, so it's kind of like a crazy thing, but real person. And in the movie, she's left behind when they leave. So it's like, it's just Mona and Jewel hanging out at the house, and then Burt Reynolds comes and is like, I'm here, I love you. And then he like picks her up, sweeps her off her feet, puts her in the truck, they drive away, and Jewel is just left there alone at the house. But you never see her again. You just like see the shot zooming out as they're pulling away, and then you see Jewel's car eventually leave the house too. And it's just like, this is so weird. Like, what a weird, sloppy ending that is. So anyway, I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, it feels rushed, and like you said, and maybe it's a side effect of like some of the stuff that got pulled. They had to just wrap it up with the voiceover from Jim Nabors. But yeah, I don't know. It's the one thing in the film that didn't work for me, and it kind of bummed me out because it was like, otherwise this thing worked so well, was doing so well, and it just doesn't stick the ending. Otherwise, like I said, it was such a fun little romp for 2 hours.
Totally. And I think, like, I Will Always Love You is a great song, but like, I feel like that's one of the biggest problems with the ending and the way that the story resolves, is just that, like, it really feels like, probably Dolly Parton just really wanted that in the movie. And so the ending is written to make that fit within the movie. And it just doesn't totally work. It's not really the right kind of song. It doesn't really fit with the story.
I think it also feels like she feels so strong throughout the film, and then that number kind of makes her feel like, I don't know, it puts the power on him in a way. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it feels like she's lost her authority, and she's trying to say, like, no, you can't go. Like, I will always love you. Like, please. And then, like, he takes her, and he's like, I'm going to make you my bride. I don't know. There's just, like, you're right. That song feels out of place.
Yeah.
And look, again, the reality is that song became a huge hit for Whitney Houston in The Bodyguard, another film. And so it's one of those moments that you kind of are pulled out for a minute because you're like, wait, what the hell? And like, maybe in 1982 it would have less of that effect, but post Bodyguard, you can't sing that song without the audience going, this is Whitney's song. So
yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a disappointing ending, but it is actually so short. It's such a small part of the movie in the grand scheme of things that I'm kind of like, well, can't win them all. So Adam, like, what about the things that feels like Simpsons jokes but aren't? You sort of mentioned you had a whole list of these. So what were some of the other moments that jumped out to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it was on like my first or second page of notes. Like I wrote, God, this whole thing feels like a Simpsons episode.
Yeah.
Like it just has, both in terms of like the kind of what they're addressing and the approach, but there are a lot of gags that are very Simpsons-y. So like, right off the top in the opening narration where Jim Nabors is sort of explaining the history of the chicken ranch, he talks about how like the World War I veterans went there and they had such a good time that they like sent their kids back after World War II. And it's like, it does like a cross dissolve and the sign sort of changes. Jewel has the line of, y'all come back now, you hear? And literally all the people who have just left immediately like do a U-turn and then like come rushing back in,
Right.
which is just like such a Simpsons-y gag. Early in the film, you're sort of introduced to Ed Earl and like what he has to deal with on a daily basis. And he has to deal with a mule has sat on Miss Modine's car. So it's supposed to like establish the like quaint little town that they live in, but it's just like such an absurd image of literally a mule sitting on the hood of a car.
Feels like a Cletus bit.
Yeah, very much so. When he's talking to Melvin P. Thorpe and he's sort of going through all of these scams that he's uncovered, and he's talking about the nuts in the chocolate bar. He's like, it needs to have a full nut. A half nut's not a full nut. And that again, like that whole run just feels like one of those sort of like improvised Albert Brooks runs, like the sort of the mattress the hammock district.
Yeah.
Like it feels very in line with that.
Sure.
And just like Melvin's character in and of itself, like, you know, Dom DeLuise could have played that character on The Simpsons and it would feel 100% at home. I think of all the stuff, like even like stuff we watched season 1, like no other movie we've watched kind of has this many jokes that really, like, if they had been in a Simpsons episode, like they would feel totally at home. Like this of that.
Totally, 100%. Cool. Well, should we talk about our final takeaways here? What's your verdict? Would you recommend it? I mean, it seems like we've kind of already addressed that, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I genuinely surprised by this one. Went into it kind of with trepidation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I remember pulling it up on IMDb and seeing that poster and just kind of going, oh yeah, I need to figure out what this thing is all about.
Right.
But was kind of going into it being like, this isn't going to be any good. I was expecting burlesque. I was expecting a movie that would be so bad it's good and you just make fun of it for 2 hours. And I was not expecting to be so drawn in by the characters, so drawn in by the love subplot, to find the performances as charming as I did, to find it as funny as I did.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this was a genuine surprise to me in the best way possible. And yeah, I think people should definitely try and track it down. Like, it's unlike anything else we've watched this season, and, you know, even last season. To your point of, like, considering how successful it was, the fact that it effectively doesn't exist, nobody remembers it,
yeah.
I would kind of like to see that change, because I think there's something there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's, you know, what stands out to me is the performances, I think, are really good. The songs are really good. Almost every number is memorable. And then, yeah, the actual, like, filmmaking, right? I mean, like we were talking about, it's just, like, it feels like it deserves to be a movie and not just a stage play in terms of the way that it uses the medium. So I think that's really exciting. You know, I think the only downside is really just that missed opportunity with the ending and maybe kind of addressing some of the themes a little bit more completely. But, like, yeah, it's super entertaining and I think definitely worth checking out. What about other movies or other media that you think people should check out if they like this, or, you know, for anything similar?
The whole time I was sort of thinking about that, and I was like, what am I going to recommend as, like, extra credit? Because, to be honest, I couldn't think of anything else like this. The whole time I was watching it, I was like, this reminds me of something that I've experienced before, but I don't know what it was. And maybe it is just, like, again, Simpsons episodes. Mm-hmm. In terms of other musicals, what comes to mind is musicals that are sort of, like, more adult-based humor or dealing with adult themes. So I think of things like Avenue Q, which is a sort of parody of Sesame Street, but is very sort of very bawdy show. It's actually written by the guys who wrote Frozen, like the music to Frozen.
I don't think I knew that.
So they've had a very interesting career. They also co-wrote the music along with the South Park guys to Book of Mormon, which is another show that is very sort of like this adult humor. You wouldn't want to take your kids to it, but it is like, it kind of tonally feels kind of similar. It's satirical. And then also there's a musical which is based on the Frank Oz movie Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but there's a musical that's based on that. And it's kind of got a similar tone, similar vibe. In terms of films, I mean, we mentioned Burlesque. It is tonally not similar at all, but the subject matter is maybe kind of similar. And that is another one where, like, again, just, like, get a bunch of your friends together and, you know, get some drinks going and just, like, laugh at that. I think they covered it on How Did This Get Made, and it is, like, very much a movie that would be on How Did This Get Made, because it is so, like, I genuinely do love it, but it is so bad it's good. And then, have you seen The Birdcage?
I have, yeah, totally.
It's dealing with similar-ish tones. I think it's originally based on a French play called La Cage aux Folles, which then became a musical called La Cage aux Folles. Mm-hmm. But it, you know, it's dealing with these sort of like adult themes, and Robin Williams is phenomenal in that movie. What about you? I mean, what came to mind for you?
I mean, I also struggled a little bit because this is kind of unique, but I mean, I think the obvious one would be 9 to 5, right? Not a musical, but, you know, tonally, well...
The film is not a musical, but it has subsequently been adapted into a musical.
That's true. Dolly Parton wrote the musical lyrics, I believe, for
and Allison Janney of The West Wing. I think she plays the Jane Fonda character.
Hilarious! I did not know that.
But yeah, and she actually can sing. So
there you go.
But yeah, that's a great. If you enjoyed this, you will definitely enjoy 9 to 5.
Yeah, very similar sensibility. It's very fast paced, very energetic. Also has Dolly Parton. Fantastic cast overall. Like, it's a really good one. You know, I mean, this is a completely different movie, but like, if you're interested in the sort of filmmaking side of it, like Cabaret, I mean, it's a great movie. Also about
tonally could not be more different.
Completely different. Definitely not a fun romp, but it is an astoundingly good musical, and the filmmaking is great. So I'll always recommend that one. And like the subject matter is similar in some ways. Mm-hmm. The other one that I haven't seen, but I imagine might be very relevant, would be Nashville, which I've heard is really good.
I've also heard that's very good. I've never seen. Robert Altman is like a complete blind spot for me. I don't think I've seen any of his films.
Yeah, same. I think just like in terms of course, the country music sort of connection, but also like the satirical aspect of it and the sort of nexus of politics and entertainment and news and like all of that feels very, very relevant. So maybe that one's kind of on my list for what I might watch in the near future. So that's all I got. That's what I came up with.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. Coming up next time, you know, we're nearing the end now of our musical series, and we're going to be taking a little trip to the backstage of a little Broadway house, and we're going to be hanging out with a chorus line. Yeah. Nate, you are not familiar with this one at all, as far as I know, right?
No, not at all. Have not seen the stage show, have not seen the movie, so it's going to be a completely new experience for me, but one of my favorite Simpsons parodies, of course, is is of this.
For sure.
We'll get into all that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really fun knowing our histories. I'll be very interested to hear what you think, because not to color anybody's expectations, but the film adaptation is sort of very famously not beloved by fans of the musical, but
we'll see where we land.
We'll see where we land. So yeah, be sure to come back next week for that. And in the meantime, we shall
see you
around the plex.
Were you super familiar with Dom DeLuise before this? Because I'm not really that familiar with his work.
Weirdly, this is very bizarre, but the thing I know him from was, do you remember Lamb Chops? Like Lamb Chops Play Along? Like Sherry Lewis and Lamb Chop?
Oh, yes, I do.
Okay, so there was the TV show Lamb Chops Play Along, which was on when we were kids. And then like a few years later, there was like a spin-off sequel, and I can't remember what, I think it was called like Sherry's World.
Lamb Chops Play Along?
Okay, hold on. I need to look
my
it up. Lamb Chop. Okay, yeah. Sherry Lewis. She had another show called. This is all. I promise we're going somewhere with this.
Okay.
Yeah. So Lamb Chops Play Along. What? Well, what do you mean it's not here? It's not here. Hold on. Maybe it's just not listed. Oh God, was it like Canadian and therefore it's not in Wikipedia? Now I've really derailed this. Okay, hold on. They had Lamb Chop Special Hanukkah special.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, exactly. Charlie Hearst music. Okay, what the hell? So, okay, well, this is very bizarre because
this apparently... Dream once where Dom DeLuise was in a spin-off of Lamb Chops Play Along.
This apparently doesn't... Okay, so apparently this doesn't exist, but my memory was there was this other TV show that was like... It was like called like the Sherry Lewis Hour or something. Okay. Where it was like, it wasn't Lamb Chops Play Along, but it was like contained Lamb Chop, and Dom DeLuise played like a bizarre, like he was like a chef or a weird character. Anyway, God. I knew him from this TV show that apparently doesn't exist, and now I'm gonna have to like, anyway, so I'm familiar with him, but like I don't know that I had ever seen anything he was actually in apart from this TV show that apparently doesn't exist.
Sure. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Well, so then one of the other sort of key players we have is the governor, right? So this is Charles Durning. He's the guy who wins, or I think is nominated for Oscar for Best Supporting.
Okay, I found it.
Okay, what is it?
Sorry to interrupt. Okay, so apparently it was a TV show called The Charlie Horse Music Pizza.
Oh, okay. Because Charlie Horse is a character. I remember that.
Is another character, yes. Yeah. So Sherry Lewis, Charlie Horse, and their friends run a musical pizza parlor, and Dom DeLuise plays a character called Cookie. He's like a cook, I guess. And the funny thing, this is the other funny thing. There was a chef, I believe he was Louisianan, named Paul Prudhomme, who was like kind of overweight and wore like a not a beret, but what like the little
like a newsy cap, right?
Yeah, a newsy cap. And remember when Homer wears one when he's Big Fat Homer, and I think this Cookie character is Dom DeLuise like riffing on the Paul Prudhomme guy.
I'll probably doing the same accent as he's doing in this movie.
Yeah, so hold on. I'm gonna just put this in the chat just so you can see, because like I don't think I'm insane. So here's a picture of Dom DeLuise, and then
there he is. Is that him in this?
I don't know. That is just his IMDb photo.
Great.
And then here's Paul Prudhomme, who is looking like a real Southern boy.
Oh, indeed. Yes, you're right. It is.
So I feel like that. I feel like that must be what that character. Anyway, I can't believe we've gone down this rabbit hole, but yeah. So all this to say is, weirdly, yes, I am familiar with Dom DeLuise.